And on to the respiratory system. So let me just switch to a color that's going to work here. Okay, so the respiratory system is relatively short in comparison to some of our other systems that we've been working on, but we're going to just start with some general anatomy. And so you can see that the little animation here, the little GIF here, kind of shows a man or a person inhaling and exhaling. So to take a breath in, we call that to inspire, and to take a breath out, we call that to expire. And so you can notice here that air is going in through the nasal cavity and then traveling down the trachea, and then eventually into the bronchi, into the bronchioles, and then where the gas exchange actually happens is in the alveoli. And you can see at the bottom here that there's kind of that dome-shaped muscle, and if we look over on our graphic over here, that's called the diaphragm, and that's one of the major muscles of breathing that controls the pressure in the lungs by either expanding or contracting. Okay, so let's just take a look at some of our basic parts of the respiratory system. So first of all, your chest cavity is properly known as the thoracic cavity. So that includes the bronchioles, the bronchi, the lungs, etc. And so first of all, you have your nasal passages. And so when you inhale, your nasal passages will moisten and warm up that air because you have mucus and you have a lot of blood vessels in your nasal passages that help to warm the air before it gets to your lungs. You also remember have that mucus and that cilia as part of your first line of defense in the immune system, which will also trap pathogens, make you sneeze if a pathogen gets in there, etc. So continuing down that respiratory tract, we have the pharynx, and remember the pharynx is the back of the throat. We learned about that in the digestive system rather, and so don't get the pharynx and the larynx confused. The pharynx is the back of the throat. That's where the nerves are, that when the food hits the back of the throat, that will trigger that reflex for you to swallow and get that food down your esophagus and eventually into your stomach. So then you'll notice that we have that flap of tissue called the epiglottis, and remember that we studied that in the digestive system as well. And the epiglottis, remember, is a flap of tissue that will close over the trachea when you swallow to prevent food from going into your trachea and then eventually possibly into your lungs. Remember, at the top of your throat, you have the uvula, and the uvula prevents liquid or fluid from getting up into your nasal passages. The epiglottis prevents food from going down into your windpipe or your trachea. So then we have the larynx, and if you kind of feel where your Adam's apple is here, okay, you can kind of feel that the cartilage seems to be a little thicker in there. That's the larynx, and that's where your vocal cords are, okay? So pharynx, back of the throat, larynx, that's where your vocal cords are. And then, of course, we have our trachea. And notice that our trachea kind of has these little rings on there, and the trachea is made of cartilage, and so you have those little rings of cartilage that are C-shaped, and they fit around the trachea, so like this, okay, so C shape, and then like this, so that of course, because your esophagus is behind your trachea, when you swallow, you don't want like a solid ring of cartilage scraping against your esophagus, so the C shape allows the trachea to maintain its shape, but then it also has that opening at the back so that your esophagus can go through peristalsis and move food without actually being damaged against that cartilage. So then you'll notice that as we continue down our respiratory tract, we then branch off from the trachea into two branches called the bronchi. And so bronchi is plural, bronchus is singular. So you have one on each side going into your lungs. The next thing that'll happen is, you can see down here, we have these little guys called the bronchioles. And so what happens then is that the bronchi will narrow into these little bronchioles, which are very fine, okay, very fine, like human hair fine. And you have this vast network of bronchioles in the lungs. And then, even though you can't see it here, at the end of those bronchioles, that's where you have the alveoli, which are those little cluster of grape-looking structures, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and that's where the actual gas exchange happens, is in the alveoli. So one important thing to remember about the lungs is that your lungs are not balloons. So quite often, even if we look at our little animation here, it kind of looks like the lungs are balloons and they're just kind of inflating, deflating, inflating, deflating. Not exactly. The lungs are spongy tissue, but the lung tissue itself is actually to protect the delicate bronchioles and the delicate alveoli, which actually work to do the gas exchange. And then, of course, as we said, the diaphragm, this umbrella kind of shaped muscle here, very large muscle of breathing, is one of the main muscles responsible for helping you both inhale and exhale by facilitating pressure changes. So moving along here, when we talk about breathing, as we said, always optimal to breathe through your nasal cavity because it moistens and warms the air, helps filter out pathogens, etc., to prevent us from getting sick. Very large number of blood vessels in there. That's why when you get a nosebleed, it seems like, oh my gosh, how is this much blood coming out of my nose? It's because there's a very vast network of blood vessels in there. And again, the purpose of that is to warm the air because, of course, blood is warm, right? Warms the air so that it doesn't do damage to your lungs as it's traveling in there. So as we said, we hit the pharynx and then the trachea or the windpipe. And of course, when we swallow, that epiglottis will flap over that windpipe to prevent food from getting down there. And the C-shaped rings, as we already discussed, helps prevent the trachea from collapsing and gives it structure because it's made out of cartilage. So what happens if you do have that epiglottis failure? And we've all experienced that when we actually something goes down the wrong way is kind of what we call it. And when something goes down the wrong way, what it means is something kind of snuck past the epiglottis when you were swallowing. Sometimes it's because you're laughing, or if you're eating something like, has vinegar or something like that. Sometimes it just kind of sneaks past the epiglottis. And you'll probably notice from your own experience that what that does is it triggers this epic cough that you just can't control, you can't stop. And that's because in your trachea, you have these little cilia, which are these little hair-like structures, and they're extremely sensitive when they're stimulated. So when a little food particle or something gets down there, or a little fluid particle gets down there, it stimulates the cilia, and what it does is it triggers that coughing reflex, because the whole point is to get that fluid or food particle out of your trachea before it finds its way into your lungs, because that can create a lot of very serious health issues. So continuing along here, just to look at some of our anatomy, we talked about the larynx as being the voice box, okay, because this is where your vocal cords are housed. So if we take a look at our graphic here, you can see that this is a person that has a normal larynx, so no inflammation or nodes or anything on the vocal cords. And I know this kind of looks weirdly like a mouth, but this is actually the epiglottis, okay? Okay, that's your epiglottis. And then, of course, you have your larynx, and these here would be your vocal cords. And just to kind of show where we are, this is this structure right here, okay? Now, in males, vocal cords change during puberty, and that's why boys, when they're in junior high and stuff, sometimes they go through that weird situation where their voices are kind of up and down, or squeaky and then not, and deep and then squeaky. And that's because the vocal cords are responding to the hormonal changes in the boy's body, and they actually are thickening. And so as the vocal cords get thicker, that actually changes the voice, because it changes as the air passes the vocal cord. When the vocal cord's thicker, it actually changes the timbre of the voice, okay? So males, once they get past puberty, do have these different, these thicker vocal cords, which means they have deeper voices. Now, this graphic here is an actual photograph of what the vocal cords look like, okay? So again, it looks weirdly like a lip here, but that actually is the epiglottis, which will close over the trachea when you swallow. So as we said, the lungs themselves are actually not these like airbags or balloons like flapping around in your chest. They actually are spongy tissue. But again, if we look at the exterior, this is nice healthy lungs here, nice and pink and healthy. When we look at the exterior of the lungs, that spongy tissue is actually to protect the delicate bronchioles and the delicate alveoli that are deeply embedded inside the lung tissue. So the lungs, in terms of anatomy, are surrounded by what we call pleural membranes. So if we look at our little graphic here, you can see that we have this double membrane, okay, that surrounds and protects our lungs. And it also attaches our lungs to the thoracic cavity or to our rib cage. So your lungs aren't just like flapping around in your chest. They actually are anchored to the thoracic cavity wall, and of course to the diaphragm, so that that can facilitate taking air in and forcing air out. And each lung is surrounded by those pleural membranes, and inside that pleural membrane is what we call pleural fluid. So you can kind of see the lighter blue kind of area in between those two membranes, and that's pleural fluid. And what the pleural fluid actually does is it offers protection, and it also offers cushioning to protect the lungs, okay? Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting here, you can see on the graphic, is that the left lung is actually a little bit smaller than the right lung because it has this cardiac notch, okay? So if you even look at our real picture here, it kind of has this kind of indent here that's called the cardiac notch. And being that it's called the cardiac notch, I bet you can kind of tell me what that is actually for. Yeah, for the heart, right? So it just kind of has that little bit of extra space because your heart, of course, is kind of situated just to the left, right? And the other thing that's important when we talk about the bronchioles and versus the bronchi is the bronchioles are actually capable of constriction and dilation, okay? Your trachea is not capable of that, and the bronchi are not capable of that, okay? So the bronchi and the trachea are quite rigid, okay? And they have the cartilage to maintain structure, okay? But once you get down to the bronchioles do not have those rings of cartilage, and they're very fine, and they actually are smooth muscle surrounded so that they can actually dilate and constrict to facilitate gas exchange. And the type of muscle that we find in our bronchioles is that smooth muscle. So same muscle that we have lining our digestive tract, which facilitates peristalsis. So if we take a look a little more closely at our bronchioles, so here again is our general structure. So here's our trachea, and then going into our bronchus, right? And then the bronchus continues to narrow and continues to narrow until we get to the bronchiole. So you'll notice once we get down to the super small, teeny tiny bronchiole, we no longer have those rings of cartilage that provide structure, okay? But what we do have now is smooth muscle. Okay, so if we look at this graphic over here, this is a nice healthy bronchiole, and you can see it has that smooth muscle wall, very similar to the arteries, for example, and therefore is capable of the expanding and constricting. At the very end of the bronchioles is the alveoli. And so if we kind of blow that up a little bit so we can see it a little bit bigger, you can see that the alveoli have that characteristic kind of bunch of grape-like structures, and that's where gas exchange happens. Now, in this top diagram here, it kind of looks like you have just like one bronchiole, but in fact, it's much more like this graphic here, where you have this vast network of these bronchioles and alveoli that are extremely dense inside of that spongy lung tissue that helps protect those delicate structures. So the alveoli themselves, this is kind of one of the more important concepts when we talk about the respiratory system. So let's just look at a couple different diagrams here, because we're always so used to seeing just those nice uniform clusters of grapes like we see in the drawings. But this first one here is actually a microscopic image, okay, a micrograph, and you can see this one's two-dimensional, so that tells us that this is not an electron microscope. But in any case, you can see the bronchiole is here, right? And then the alveolar sac, okay, right? And so kind of connected together. Now, this graphic here I really like. This is an electron microscope image, so an electron micrograph. So you can see that these guys are kind of the alveoli, so they look more like those grape clusters in this diagram. And then look at this vast, the red kind of structures here, the vast network of capillaries surrounding the alveoli, because remember, just like in every other part of your body, the capillaries are what bring oxygen, nutrients, and facilitate that gas exchange, right? So alveoli is plural, alveolus is singular, has that cluster of grape sort of appearance there. The lungs literally contain hundreds of millions of alveoli. As a matter of fact, it's estimated that if you were to take the alveoli out of your lungs and spread them out in a single layer, it would actually cover an entire tennis court, like a standard regulation tennis court. So you have a lot of alveoli to facilitate the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide gas. Alveoli are super thin, one cell layer thick, and just like we talked about with our capillaries, the alveoli are super thin as well to allow for quick diffusion. If your alveoli were super thick, you would probably die of oxygen deprivation before you actually got any oxygen to your tissues. So really thin to allow efficient and fast exchange of gas. So we only have to diffuse that oxygen and CO2 a very short distance. So one of the criteria that you have to do for IB is to be able to draw and label an alveoli, and so, or an alveolus, I should say. So if we take a look here, this diagram here is quite important, and I hope this kind of fishnet looking thing looks kind of familiar to you by now, because of course that's a capillary bed. So you can see that just like every other tissue in our body, the alveoli have access to a capillary bed, and when blood flows to the lungs, so this is where we kind of put everything together, so comes from the right side of the heart, that deoxygenated blood, right, goes from that pulmonary artery to the lungs, and it's bringing with it no oxygen, but it's bringing lots of CO2. So that's why it has the blue color, right? Because remember, from that right side of the heart, the blood's deoxygenated. It's already been taken to your tissues, delivered oxygen, and then coming back to the heart, it's got lots of CO2 in it. So coming into the alveoli, the blood is high carbon dioxide. But of course, when you take a breath in and you're getting that oxygen, the blood leaving the alveoli and then eventually going back to the left side of the heart through the pulmonary vein is going to be high oxygen. So the blood coming in passes the CO2 into the alveoli so you can exhale it. The blood going out is now oxygen rich and can head back to the left side of your heart so it can be pumped out to the rest of your body. So when we talk about gas exchange, there's just a couple of terms that are specific to IB, and that would be the pneumocytes, okay? But surfactant is actually in our program of studies, okay? So the type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes, those are very specific IB terminology, so they're specialized lung cells. But surfactant is something that is in our program of studies for Alberta Education as well. So as we already said, alveoli are super thin to facilitate that quick gas exchange. And so type 1 pneumocytes, okay, again, this is IB, they are responsible for gas exchange, okay? And these are the ones that, like I said, if we spread them out, they would cover like an entire tennis court. Now, type 2 pneumocytes, they secrete a very special sort of lubricating substance called surfactant. And so what surfactant does is it actually prevents the alveoli from kind of collapsing and sticking together. And what I want you to think about is if you think about like blowing up a balloon, like just a plain old balloon, birthday party balloon, and then remember what happens like when the balloon pops, it kind of just like sticks together. And so if your alveoli collapse, the sides of the alveoli like stick together instead of being that nice plump balloon, they stick together and then they are incapable of gas exchange. So surfactant is necessary to actually keep the walls of the alveoli from collapsing and sticking to one another, because then we can't actually have any gas exchange with the oxygen and the CO2. Now that's why when babies are born prematurely, if they're born quite prematurely, that is, not a couple of days, but if they're born too early, because the lungs are one of the last structures to actually develop, sometimes the baby's type 2 pneumocytes aren't developed enough yet to start producing that surfactant. And so that's why quite often premature babies need to be put on oxygen to help just with that gas exchange, because until their bodies actually start to produce enough of that surfactant. So the next important concept here is breathing and muscles. And so breathing and muscles, just going to get rid of the picture here, maybe, or not. I thought I could get rid of it, maybe not. Anyway, the breathing and muscles is kind of an important concept as well. So as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, one of the most important muscles of breathing is this sort of parachute-shaped diaphragm muscle that you'll notice is kind of wedged up and under your rib cage, and it's attached to your rib cage. So how exactly are we able to take air in and push air out? So pressure differences between the chest cavity and the atmosphere is what actually allows us to breathe in and breathe out. Okay, so if you think about your basic laws of physics, gases always want to move from high pressure to low pressure. Okay, that's the natural order of things, okay? Gases never want to go the opposite way. We always want to go from high pressure to low pressure. So when you inspire or breathe in, the pressure inside the lungs is lower than outside. Atmospheric pressure is pretty constant, okay, within reason. Like obviously if you go to like a super high altitude or whatever, you know, you can have changes in atmospheric pressure, but when you're just like walking around in Edmonton, atmospheric pressure is relatively constant. It's your lung pressure that actually changes. So when you inhale, the pressure inside the lungs is actually lower than it is outside. So that allows you to bring air in because the air pressure, the atmospheric pressure is higher than the pressure in your lungs. And the air wants to move from where it's high pressure into your lungs where it's low pressure. Now, the opposite is true when you expire or you exhale. So when you are pushing air out, then that means that you actually have higher pressure in your lungs than you do on the outside of your body, than you do in the atmospheric pressure. And that's what allows you to push that air out, not ouch, out, although it might be ouch, who knows. The change in lung pressure is created by the change in the volume of lungs, and that's because of that diaphragm muscle. So if we look at our little animation there, you can see that when you inhale versus exhale, the contraction and relaxation of the diaphragm muscle actually changes. So take a look there. Let's wait for one more cycle. When you inhale, notice what happens. The lungs are pulled down and they expand. When you exhale, okay, notice what happens. The diaphragm pushes up and it decreases the space that's available in your lungs. So looking at that a little more closely, when you inhale, the diaphragm contracts. Okay, so if we take a look at this one this is our inspiring or breathing in. So when you inhale, the diaphragm contracts and it actually pulls down on the lungs. And think about that for a minute. What's happening is you're actually increasing the amount of space in the lungs. And that means that the air, right, that's in there has more space. More space means less pressure. Right? So when you inhale, the diaphragm contracts and flattens and the lungs expand. And as a result, the pressure on the outside, the atmospheric pressure, is now higher than the air pressure in your lungs. So that's what allows you to take air in. And you can see that visually here, right? Now, if you look at the exhaling or the breathing out, notice what happens. The diaphragm relaxes, goes back into its characteristic umbrella kind of type shape. And then notice what happens, kiddos. You can see it here. Look how much less space there is in your lungs compared to when you were inhaling. Less space means those air particles are squished closer together, and that means more pressure. So when you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes, becomes dome-shaped, and lung volume is reduced. And now what that means is atmospheric pressure is lower than lung pressure. So the air is going to want to move out from high pressure in your body to low pressure in the atmosphere. Now, in addition to those, the diaphragm muscles that we also have what's called intercostal muscles, and these are rib muscles. Now, there's a couple different kinds of intercostal muscles. There's internal, external. For our purposes, we just have to know intercostal muscle, that intercostal muscle are the rib muscles. So, of course, we already know that we have our diaphragm, right? So that's our big muscle of breathing there, right? So we have our diaphragm, but then we also have, you can see it here, these bands of muscle in between our ribs, and those are called our intercostals. And so the intercostals will work with the diaphragm to help create those pressure changes that we talked about on the previous slide. So when you inhale, the intercostal muscles contract, lifting the rib cage up and out. And if you take a deep breath, you can feel that. You can feel that expansion of your thoracic cavity. And when you exhale, so if you force a breath out, you can feel your chest kind of compress, right? And get smaller as those intercostal muscles actually relax. Okay, so the intercostal muscles work with the diaphragm to help produce those pressure changes that allow us to inhale and exhale respectively. So the last concept that we have to take a look at here is alveolar gas exchange. So we basically have two types of gas exchange that are going on. We have external, and just think about what external means, and we have internal respiration, okay? So external respiration is the gas exchange between the air and the alveoli of the blood capillaries. So just like in our previous slide, a little bit ago where we saw that nice big alveolus, and then it was surrounded by that nice fishnet of capillaries. And we talked about, CO2 going in and oxygen then being distributed back to the heart. So here we have what we're talking about there. So this would be an alveolus here, okay? And then of course, surrounding the alveolus, you can see we have our capillaries, right? So this is in our lungs, and this is that capillary bed that is surrounding the alveolus. And so the external respiration is that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So notice if we look at our little arrows here. So CO2 is leaving the capillary, because remember, it's dirty blood coming in, right? Because that's coming from the right side of our heart. So CO2 is leaving the alveolus rather, leaving the capillary and going into the alveolus. And on the other hand, oxygen is leaving the alveolus and going into the capillaries, right? So that it can go back to the left side of the heart and get pumped out to the rest of the body with all that nice oxygen. So you breathe in, the air gets into the alveoli, and then the oxygen that you inhaled is going to move into the capillaries and be distributed back to your heart. And then when you're ready to exhale, that CO2 that your capillaries dropped off into the alveoli, you're going to exhale that back out. Okay, so that's the external gas exchange. So think of external as in you're getting rid of the CO2, you're breathing it back out into the air. So oxygen is going to diffuse out of the alveoli into the capillary. CO2 is going to be the opposite. Now, the other type of exchange is internal. And if we look at internal here, you can see that this is now the exchange inside our bodies between our body tissues, like our little muscle cells here, and the capillaries, okay? So CO2, because it's a waste product, right, of cellular respiration, CO2 is going to move into the blood to be taken back to the lungs. Oxygen is going to move from the capillaries to the muscle tissue to keep that cellular respiration going, right? So internal is all about your cells getting rid of the CO2 and getting that CO2 back into the alveoli so you can exhale it. And likewise, that oxygen-rich blood is going to drop off oxygen into the tissues so that cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration, can keep working. Now, the very last concept on this slide is that it's a common misconception that it's oxygen that controls breathing rate. It's actually carbon dioxide gas, okay? So what happens basically is when you are in times of short-term oxygen deprivation, so let's say you're exercising, okay, that's like the most common example, you're exercising, and you'll notice when you start to exercise that you start to breathe faster, that's your ventilation rate, right? So you breathe faster and faster and faster, and the reason that happens is because your blood will start to get more CO2 in it, right? Because you're undergoing cellular respiration, you're using up that oxygen, and you're making lots of CO2. Now, your medulla oblongata, which remember is your brain stem, your lizard brain, right? Your medulla oblongata controls breathing, just like it controls heart rate and all those other kind of autonomic things that you don't have to think about. Your medulla will get the information that CO2 levels in your blood are increasing. And then it will send a message to your muscles of breathing and to your heart actually to start beating faster, and your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles to start contracting faster, and that increases your rate of breathing or your ventilation rate. And remember, the whole point is because the faster you breathe, the more CO2 you get rid of when you exhale, and the more oxygen you take in when you inhale. So the takeaway there is it's actually carbon dioxide levels in your blood that control your ventilation rate, not oxygen levels, okay? So the chemoreceptors that you have in your aorta, for example, and in your medulla, they are sensitive to CO2 levels, not to oxygen levels.